Hello, 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 hello. Well, it's Sunday and we're back. So, please let everyone know that we are streaming. Please post it on your social media accounts, put it out on X or wherever it is that you get fine social media tweets while I go turn on the third light over there. Please send it out. I'll be right back. And let me know the audio and video should be good. We had a little bit of echoing last time, so let me know if there's any issues. Hopefully my title card has not scared people away. Okay. We got 4 people watching. Okay, well, for some reason people aren't really filing in. What's up, SB? What's up, Reg? We will let people filter in. So today we are doing part 2 of the Age of Reason. And we'll see how far we get. And I expect everyone to behave. I expect everyone to be not trolly and to remember that we have a moderator and to not be posting all kinds of God knows what. I already get enough comments during the day of people saying the most horrible, awful, awful things to me on social media or sending me emails telling me to kill myself and all kinds of ridiculous internet things like that, which I don't take seriously. But I do take seriously when people send me nice messages. So we'll just sage the area here first. La 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 la. Trolls be gone. Trolls be gone. Trolls be gone. Hi, Jackna. Thomas. No, I don't know. And I usually don't check my email. Human trafficking. What was that about? I did not see that. Okay. We're saging the environment. Saging the environment from any Nazis who want to come in or any communists or anybody who's just totally off the deep end. Okay. So, hopefully everyone saw the last recap, or recapped at least. Excuse me. Hopefully everyone saw the last video. And Jacknafine got the stream notification while working with Sandalphon. Hilarious. Hails Louv. Hi, Silly Dilly. What's up? Oh, you liked the one from last week. All right. Well, hopefully you all saw the one from last week, which was Age of Reason Part 1. For those who haven't, don't worry. You're still in the right place. But let's just recap real quick. Thomas Paine, most known for writing Common Sense, which was a tract urging the early colonists to split from England, and is responsible to some extent for starting America. And he is a deist. He is one of the people that the founding fathers were fraternizing with and reading. He is an excellent exemplar and expounder, I think, of what America was meant to be at the beginning, which is a haven for freedom for everybody. Thank you, Thomas. I will take a look at that about voodoo and human trafficking. I haven't seen that yet. And you're interested in making a documentary or connecting with media people? I will definitely look for that. If you haven't seen my video on voodoo and human trafficking, please do. It's definitely one of the most important videos on this channel if you go back through live. So this book, however, is not about politics. It's about religion. And specifically, it's about the deist view. Deism was essentially the belief system that America was founded on. And as I pointed out very, very clearly, I hope, in the first episode of The Age of Reason. Hello, Shebrew. Hello, Dariel Lux. Hello, Three Foxes. Don't go too far off the deep end. Nice to see you all. We all go a little off the deep end sometimes, but just make sure you come back with the hopeful, useful information for the rest of us, hopefully. But anyways, as I pointed out very, very clearly in the last video, America is not a Christian nation. It was not founded as a Christian nation. So when Christian nationalists say that, don't listen to them. They either don't know their history or they're deliberately lying. They're projecting what they want America to be. America is a deist nation. And a deist nation, importantly, critically, A deist nation is not an atheist or even an agnostic nation. That's why on the dollar bill it says one nation under God. However, it doesn't specify what God or what religion, and that's essentially what deism is. Deism is the assumed belief that there is a God, but past that, it's largely non-sectarian, and specifically, it has a certain view of the cosmos that God. It's kind of an interesting step between the old model of the universe that it was created by God and the Big Bang theory. Now we have even more complex theories about where the universe came from. For instance, one of my favorites by the physicist Roger Penrose, who suggests that yes, there was a Big Bang, but that the universe blips in and out of existence. I find this very satisfying. Also, Mitch Horowitz just posted on Instagram today. Thank you, A. Bannister. Mitch Horowitz posted on Instagram that scientists are now saying that our galaxy is irregular and may exist in a black hole. Wild stuff. Interesting stuff. But America is a deist nation, and deism is the belief in a watchmaker God. Much like the Big Bang, it's the idea that God created the universe but then largely stepped away from it. And no prophet has some singular claim to the truth. No religion has some singular claim to the truth. And it's an attitude that went hand in hand with science. The idea that we can discover, as Europe became more and more literate, more and more educated, and also when caffeine was introduced into the New World, into Europe from the New World, with coffee, it prompted a burst in intelligence, and essentially Europe left behind the superstition that it had come out of and started to go towards the scientific method. And this is, yes, Mitch is wonderful. And this is part of our spiritual history. Deism is what America was founded on. It's what Freemasonry is based on. And Thomas Paine this is the first book to be given essentially to the general public explaining deism. And it was written for the general public, and it was written as a revolutionary broadside. Specifically, it was written to be read aloud. It was written to be read in coffee shops and pubs for an audience that would be listening and that would get riled up and want change. And as we all discovered in the last one, it sounds really good when read out loud. And it only gets more bombastic as it goes on, because I assume he was figuring people would check out around the beginning, and he hides the really revolutionary stuff towards the end. So we're going to go into chapter 2. If you haven't seen the first one, don't worry. You can still follow along. Howdy, Chad. What's up, Septimus? What's up, Stockopolis? And so you don't have to have seen the first one, but I put the link to the first one below if you want to go check that out. But stay in this one so that I have lots of concurrent viewers in my stream. All right. Thomas says it also shows on your website about Buddhist magic. What's the sign up? So that should be at magic.me. It's magick.me, and you can find the class on Buddhist magic there. Okay. So, however, before we jump into this, we haven't done it in a few Sunday sermons, so let's go to our new feature, the Evil Brotherhood Tracker. Okay. Yes, I hope you like that. That will be our new Evil Brotherhood tracker. And Crowley used to call it the Black Brotherhood, but I've changed it to Evil Brotherhood so nobody gets it twisted. And specifically, that means the theocratic systems that want to tell everyone else what to do. And there's several of them, but right now, and for the foreseeable future, the worst ones are Islam by far, by a gigantic light years margin, followed in some countries, particularly our own, by the resurgence of Christian extremism and nationalism. Okay, but even that is far less of a problem. Okay, so let's see what the religion of peace has brought us today, shall we? This week. So here's jihadi attacks in the last week from all over the world. Number 1, Niger on the 22nd, just yesterday, jihadis massacre 44 innocent villagers. Stockopolis, you will be booted for good if you keep trolling. If you behave, you'll be fine. Second, Somalia on the 18th, so that was what, Monday or Tuesday, 4 bystanders are caught up in an attempt by al-Shabaab to kill the Somali president with a bomb. Interesting story on this. I used to live in deep East Brooklyn, like 10 stops in off the Halsey Street stop on the L, if anyone's in New York and knows it. And this was in like 2006. It was bad. We saw people get chucked out of windows by drug dealers. There was an anarchist cell in my building that gave me bed bugs and like all this insane stuff. And also there was a group of Nigerian terrorists that apparently lived nearby. And unbeknownst to us, there was a fuel line that went underneath all the apartments from us to JFK. All right, goodbye, Stockopolis. Please don't come back to this chat again. Thank you. You're just distracting from all the people who are here trying to pay attention. Moderator, please remove him yet again. Okay, so Stockopolis is saying blood and soil. So just so everyone knows, when you see that phrase, blood and soil or Blut und something is a Nazi catchphrase. It was the Nazi propaganda phrase where they said that they only wanted Germany for Germans. Okay, so he's a Nazi. He's using Nazi phrase. Harold the God King, I think that's some fascist thing too. That's a German thing. So you're not invited back, Stockopolis. Please reconsider your life decisions. There's lots of information on the internet and in the world about why you shouldn't be a Nazi, and I highly recommend you check it out. So anyways, I was living in this place, and Somalian terrorists had this brilliant idea. They would light the jet fuel line on fire that went from them to JFK so that they could blow up JFK. And of course, the line went right under where I was living. This was the same place that somebody bought a dingo to scare away his friends that had moved in, had got out of prison and moved across the street. So luckily that didn't happen. The plot was foiled by the FBI. We only found out about it later, but just thought I would share that lovely bit there. All right, what else do we have from the religion of leaving people in pieces? Same day in Pakistan, very same day, Islamic State gunmen assassinate a rival cleric. Yeah, if you want my attention, do something useful. Do something valuable. Contribute to the channel. Ask an interesting question. Give interesting feedback. Don't be coming in here shouting Nazi stuff, because you're just wasting everyone's time. This is, I mean, look, even this is the Middle East. Well, this is Pakistan, okay, and this is Islam. This would be going on even if Israel didn't exist. This would still be happening. All right. Next, just today in Kenya, this just went up. Al-Shabaab gunmen storm a police camp and mow down a half dozen. Ouch. Next, on the 20th, which would have been Thursday, a dozen women are among 48 ethnic Africans purged, that of course means murdered, by Arab militia. That's awful. Did you hear about it on the news? Nope. Are you hearing anything about Syria on the news? Nope. But you're hearing all about how horrible Israel, they didn't miss a beat. Israel has murdered more people after months of peace negotiations that Hamas bucked and refused to negotiate. So you heard lots about that, but you're not hearing about what's going on all over the world because Western media doesn't care about Africa. Shockingly, to its great, what's the right word? It's a terrible oversight. Africa is a good chunk of the landmass on the planet, and a whole lot is going on there that will determine the fate of everything and that is intimately connected with the entire world, just like everything else is, and yet you never hear any coverage of it. They love to call everyone else racist, but they won't even touch Africa with a 10-foot pole. We need to know what's going on there because not only is the U.S. military deployed there in large numbers under AFRICOM, but also there's a huge resource grab from China, which is essentially trying to come in and play an imperial role in Africa. You never hear about that. Also Russia, also probably other people. They're fighting over rare earth minerals, over gold. Jihad is sweeping across Africa like wildfire and could well take a good chunk of the country, helped along, of course, by the Marxist revolutions that started in the 60s and 70s. It's a mess, right? But do we know anything about it? No. How can you leave an entire continent out of your information diet and claim that you are well informed? Yes, Eric. Yeah, Temple says this Nazi just wanted my attention. Eric says that can be achieved by being smart in the chat. Yes, you can. You're welcome to my attention. You can have my attention. Just contribute. Yeah. Oh, Oren says that. Oren, I hope everyone who's in our vampire game, I hope everyone has caught up with our vampire game. This morning we had a missile coming from Yemen to Israel, but it was intercepted, fortunately. Man, how often does that happen? Because the impression that I was getting is like it's practically every day. That must be frustrating and anxiety-inducing, I would say. I shouldn't laugh because it's not funny, but all right. So there's our evil Brotherhood tracker for today. What can I say? I'm not making it up. I'm not fabricating this out of whole cloth, as people would like to say. Yeah, by the way, I'm keeping all of my good content for YouTube now. I'm not posting on Instagram anymore. Every time I post on Instagram or Facebook, I get wall-to-wall hate comments from communist tweakers who just can't figure it out at all, who just decide that instead of listening to things that have nothing to do with me and that are objectively true, that no, they want to shoot the messenger. I'm the problem. I'm hateful. I'm the evil bigot. I need to transcend and embrace love, as if they even know anything about what love is. So I'm keeping it to YouTube. Oren says, in the past few days, almost every day. What's that like? I'm curious. That sounds bad. Okay. So, on with the show. Age of Reason. And of course, we have another super chat goal for the final cat reveal. We've revealed 2 dogs and 3 cats. And there's 1 more cat to go. Somebody said I have 27 cats. Don't give anyone any ideas. This is the final cat. His name is Jupiter. And he's a long-haired black cat. And we will show him to you, but only if I get 10 super chats. And of course, please make sure to join the channel. We have, I think, almost 60 subscribers now, which is phenomenal, and it helps out a lot. In fact, real quick, that has no audio. Hello, Yitnal. Real quick, please subscribe. Please like and subscribe, of course, but also please join the channel. You get lots of perks. If you see the people in the chat with the alchemical symbols and the green, that's because they're members, and they're rightfully showing it off because they should be proud of it. So please like, subscribe, hit the notifications button so that you find out when I stream. Eventually, I will schedule these well in advance, but right now it's kind of last minute, so make sure you hit the notifications button and join the channel, please. Silly Dilly says you just need to see their shaman, Jason. I'm sure they can get you a discount. Yeah, you must have seen those comments. All right. So we finished part 1 last time. Age of Reason, part 2. And the preface recaps a bit what we already read. I have mentioned in the former part of the Age of Reason that it had long been my intention to publish my thoughts upon religion, but that I had originally reserved it to a later period in life. Wait, hang on a second. Let me make sure this is... Yeah, okay. Intending it to be the last work I should undertake. The circumstances, however... Like, Eric says my favorite Instagram comment was that yes, if you haven't seen my Instagram, people went there was a huge like eruption on my Instagram of whatever that energy is that's causing people to vandalize and burn Teslas and fling their own feces at them. Eric says my favorite Insta comment was that Jason had sad eyes. Like why I think that's probably unconsciously why I put the thumbnail on this one where I'm looking all sad and George Washington is crying. Yeah, it's very ridiculous. The circumstances, however, which existed in France in the latter end of the year 1793 determined me to delay it no longer. The first and humane principles of the revolution, which philosophy had first diffused, had been departed from. The idea, always dangerous to society, as it is derogatory to the Almighty, that priests could forgive sins, though it seemed to exist no longer, had blunted the feelings of humanity and prepared men for the commission of all crimes. The intolerant spirit of church persecutions had transferred itself into politics. So, by the way, just to remind you also, this isn't just a patriotic book. This book was put on the AA reading list by Aleister Crowley, which is a phenomenal reading list that I will probably be dipping into lots more for this channel. And he thought that this was of primary importance to high-level occult students. Primary importance. So, pay attention. This wasn't randomly chosen. It wasn't chosen just to incite people. This is a very critical book in world history. The intolerant spirit of church persecutions had transferred itself into politics. The tribunal-styled revolutionary supplied the place of an inquisition and the guillotine of the stake. I saw many of my most intimate friends destroyed, others daily carried to prison, and I had reason to believe, as had also intimations given me, that the same danger was approaching myself. Chad, this chat is moderated. Under these disadvantages, I began the former part of the Age of Reason. I had, besides, neither Bible nor Testament to refer to, though I was writing against both, nor could I procure any, notwithstanding which I have produced a work that no Bible believer, though writing at his ease, and with a library of church books about him, can refute. Oh yeah, by the way, if you want to burn a Tesla, guess what? Does it affect Elon? No. Does it affect Tesla? No. You know who are really screws over? Poor working class people who are Uber drivers who are driving those things for Uber, or simply the private property owners. And the only thing you're doing is making insurance companies happier and ruining, vastly affecting people's lives and probably leaving them with PTSD symptoms for having their private property violated. Don't fucking do that. It's ridiculous, and the rest of America rightfully thinks you're children. Okay? All right. Love you too. All right. This is oregano. Under these disadvantages, I began the former part of the Age of Reason. I had, besides, neither Bible nor Testament to refer to, though, and P.S., Paine refers to when he says Bible, he means Old Testament, and when he says Testament, he means New Testament. Though I was writing against both. Nor could I procure any, notwithstanding which I have produced a work that no Bible believer, though writing at his ease and with a library of church books about him, can refute. Toward the latter end of December of that year, a motion was made and carried to exclude foreigners from the convention. There were but two in it, Anacharsis Klutz, what a name, and myself, and I saw I was particularly pointed at by Bourbon de Loy in his speech on that motion. Conceiving, after this, that I had but a few days of liberty, I sat down and brought the work to a close as speedily as possible, and I had not finished it more than 6 hours in the state it has since appeared, before a guard came there, about 3 in the morning, with an order signed by the two committees of Public Safety and Surety General for putting me in arrestation as a foreigner, and conveyed me to the prison of the Luxembourg. Thomas says, what about help learning how to work with Santa Muerte? Look down my channel. There's an interview with an expert. I contrived on my way there to call on Joel Barlow, and I put the manuscript of the work into his hands, as more safe than in my possession in prison, and not knowing what might be the fate in France, either of the writer or the work. I addressed it to the protection of the citizens of the United States. It is with justice that I say that the guard who executed this order and the interpreter of the Committee of General Surety who accompanied them to examine my papers treated me not only with civility but with respect. The keeper of the Luxembourg, Benoit, a man of a good heart, showed to me every friendship in his power, as did also all his family. While he continued in that station, he was removed from it, put into arrestation, and carried before the tribunal upon a malignant accusation, but acquitted. After I had been in the Luxembourg about 3 weeks, the Americans then in Paris went in a body to the convention to reclaim me as their countryman and friend, but were answered by the president, Vadir, who was also president of the Committee of Surety General, and had signed the order for my arrestation. This is actually a little bit boring. Let's skip ahead to chapter 1 instead of hearing him talking about his legal troubles in France. Chapter 1. As to the Old Testament. It has often been said that anything may be proved from the Bible, but before anything can be admitted as proved by the Bible itself must be proved to be true. For if the Bible be not true, or the truth of it be doubtful, it ceases to have authority, and cannot be admitted as proof of anything. It has been the practice of all Christian commentators on the Bible, and of all Christian priests and preachers, to impose the Bible on the world as a mass of truth, and as the Word of God. They have disputed and wrangled and anathematized each other about the supposable meaning of particular parts and passages therein. One has said and insisted that such a passage meant such a thing, another that it meant directly the contrary, and a third that it meant neither one nor the other, but something different from both, and this they have called understanding the Bible. It has happened that all the answers which I have seen to the former part of the Age of Reason have been written by priests, and these pious men, like their predecessors, contend and wrangle, and understand the Bible. Each understands it differently, but each understands it best, and they have agreed in nothing but in telling their readers that Thomas Paine understands it not. Now, instead of wasting their time and heating themselves in fractious disputations about doctrinal points drawn from the Bible, these men ought to know, and if they do not, it is civility to inform them that the first thing to be understood is whether there is sufficient authority for believing the Bible to be the Word of God, or whether there is not. There are matters in that book said to be done by the express command of God that are as shocking to humanity and to every idea we have of moral justice as anything done by Robespierre, by Carrier, by Joseph Le Bon in France, by the English government in the East Indies, or by any other assassin in modern times. When we read in the books ascribed to Moses, Joshua, etc., that they, the Israelites, came by stealth upon whole nations of people, who, as history shows itself, had given them no offense, that they put all those nations to the sword, that they spared neither age nor infancy, that they utterly destroyed men, women, and children, that they left not a soul to breathe, expressions that are repeated over and over again in those books, and that too, with exulting ferocity. Are we sure these things are facts? Are we sure that the Creator of man commissioned these things to be done? And are we sure that the books that tell us so were written by his authority? So, I'll point one thing out. You can trace the DNA of a lot of like super Reddity anti-religious arguments. You can see it in here because he's making a lot of the same arguments that you'll hear, like kind of, forgive me, basic bitch arguments that people will make about religion. Like, well, what about all the bad stuff in the Old Testament? Right? So some of these arguments are a little stale by today's standards because we've heard them all a billion ass times on the internet. 93, 93, 93, James. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. So some of it is, but it's interesting to trace it back. So we're making the same, people are making the same kind of like common folk arguments against religion that he was making. So there may be a case to be made here, certainly a paper to be written about how much this influences American thought on religion even to today. It is not the antiquity of the tale that is any evidence of its truth. On the contrary, it is a symptom of its being fabulous. For the more ancient any history pretends to be, the more it has the resemblance of a fable. The origin of every nation is buried in fabulous tradition, and that of the Jews is as much to be suspected as any other. To charge the commission of acts upon the Almighty, which in their own nature and by every rule of moral justice are crimes, as all assassination is, and more especially the assassination of infants, is a matter of serious concern. The Bible tells us that those assassinations were done by the express command of God. To believe, therefore, the Bible to be true, we must unbelieve all our belief in the moral justice of God, for wherein could crying or smiling infants offend? And to read the Bible without horror, we must undo everything that is tender, sympathizing, and benevolent in the heart of man. This argument gets brought up a lot. I don't see it this way. I think that, first of all, the Old Testament is a history of the ancient world in the Middle East, which was violent. It's still violent. And I think that, and I think that also it is probably hermeneutically incorrect to attempt to judge the Old Testament by the standards of the New. If you're not Christian, if you're Jewish, you don't accept the New Testament. And here's my argument. If you're not Christian, then the New Testament doesn't apply to you, and your own religious texts should not be judged in relation to it, since it's not your religion. If you are Christian and you accept the New Testament, then the way that I look at the Bible is a record of improvement. Even, how do I put this? God chills out over time in the Bible. He even chills out in the Old Testament. And I think that when you compare, much like today, when you likely compare the protagonists of the Bible to the people surrounding them, when we're talking about the Canaanites, the Hittites, Baal worshipers, child sacrifice was widely practiced in the ancient world. Open demon worship was widely practiced. So I think it's also a bit disingenuous to judge a different culture from thousands of years ago by modern standards. So he does get a little reddity here, in my opinion, but here we are. But before I proceed to this examination, I will show wherein the Bible differs from all other ancient writings with respect to the nature of the evidence necessary to establish its authenticity. And this is the more proper to be done, because the advocates of the Bible, in their answers to the former part of the Age of Reason, undertake to say, and they put some stress thereon, that the authenticity of the Bible is as well established as that of any other ancient book, as if our belief of the one could become any rule for our belief of the other. I know, however, but of one ancient book that authoritatively challenges universal consent and belief, and that is Euclid's Elements of Geometry. And the reason is, which John Dee wrote the introduction to when it was first printed in English, and the reason is because it is a book of self-evident demonstration entirely independent of its author, and of everything relating to time, place, and circumstance. The matters contained in that book would have the same authority they have now, had they been written by any other person, or had the work been anonymous, or had the author never been known, for the identical certainty of who was the author makes no part of our belief of the matters contained in the book. But it is quite otherwise with respect to the books ascribed to Moses, to Joshua, to Samuel, etc. Those are books of testimony, and they testify of things naturally incredible, and therefore the whole of our belief as to the authenticity of these books rests, in the first place, upon the certainty that they were written by Moses, Joshua, and Samuel, secondly, upon the credit we give to their testimony. We may believe the first, that is, we may believe the certainty of the authorship, and yet not the testimony, in the same manner that we may believe that a certain person gave evidence upon a case, and yet not believe the evidence that he gave. But if it should be found that the books ascribed to Moses, Joshua, and Samuel were not written by Moses, Joshua, and Samuel, every part of the authority and authenticity of those books is gone at once. For there can be no such thing as forged or invented testimony, neither can there be anonymous testimony, more especially as to things naturally incredible, such as that of talking to God face to face, or that of the sun and moon standing still at the command of a man. All right. So a couple people are saying, Chad and Temple are saying child sacrifice is still practiced today. Okay, so my response to that is, well, if it's still practiced today, then it deserves a response as ruthless and brutal as the response given in the Old Testament. So there we are. The greatest part of the other ancient books are works of genius. Of which kind are those ascribed to Homer, to Plato, to Aristotle, to Demosthenes, to Cicero, etc.? Here again, etc. The author is not an essential in the credit we give to any of these works, for as works of genius, they would have the same merit they have now, were they anonymous. Nobody believes the Trojan story, as related by Homer, to be true, for it is the poet only that is admired, and the merit of the poet will remain, though the story be fabulous. But if we disbelieve the matters related by the Bible authors, Moses, for instance, as we disbelieve the things related by Homer, there remains nothing of Moses in our estimation but an impostor. I'm getting spicy here. As to the ancient historians, from Herodotus to Tacitus, we credit them as far as they relate things probable and credible, and no further. For if we do, we must believe the two miracles which Tacitus relates were performed by Vespasian, that of curing a lame man, and a blind man in just the same manner as the same things are told of Jesus Christ by his historians. We must also believe the miracle cited by Josephus, that is the Sea of Pamphylia opening to let Alexander and his army pass, as it is related to the Red Sea in Exodus. These miracles are quite as well authenticated as the Bible miracles, and yet we do not believe them. Consequently, the degree of evidence necessary to establish our belief of things naturally incredible, whether in the Bible or elsewhere, is far greater than that which obtains our belief to natural and probable things. And therefore, the advocates for the Bible have no claim to our belief of the Bible. I'm going to do the Elon thing. It's not focusing on me. All right. Because that we believe the things stated in other ancient writings, since that we believe the things stated in these writings no further than they, are probable and credible, or because they are self-evident, like Euclid, or admire them because they are elegant, like Homer, or approve of them because they are sedate, like Plato, or judicious, like Aristotle. Having premised those things, I proceed to examine the authenticity of the Bible, and I begin with what are called the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. My intention is to show that these books are spurious, and that Moses is not the author of them, and still further, that they were not written in the time of Moses, nor till several hundred years afterward, that they are no other than an attempted history of the life of Moses, and of the times in which he is said to have lived, and also of the times prior thereto, written by some very ignorant and stupid pretenders to authorship several hundred years after the death of Moses, as men now write histories of things that happened, or are supposed to have happened, several hundred or several thousand years ago. The evidence that I shall produce in this case is from the books themselves, and I shall confine myself to this evidence only. Were I to refer for proof to any of the ancient authors whom the advocates of the Bible call profane authors, they would controvert that authority, as I controvert theirs. I will therefore come on their own ground, and oppose them with their own weapon, the Bible. In the first place, there is no affirmative evidence that Moses is the author of those books, and that he is the author is altogether an unfounded opinion, got abroad nobody knows how. The style and manner in which those books are written give no room to believe, or even to suppose, they were written by Moses, for it is altogether the style and manner of another person speaking of Moses. In Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, for everything in Genesis is prior to the time of Moses, and not the least allusion is made to him therein, the whole, I say, of these books is in the third person. It is always, the Lord said unto Moses, or Moses said unto the Lord, or Moses said unto the people, or the people said unto Moses. And this is the style and manner that historians use in speaking of the persons whose lives and actions they are writing. It may be said that a man may speak of himself in the third person, and therefore it may be supposed that Moses did, but supposition proves nothing. And if the advocates for the belief that Moses wrote those books himself have nothing better to advance than supposition, they may as well be silent. But granting the grammatical right that Moses might speak of himself in the third person, because any man might speak of himself in that manner, it cannot be admitted as a fact in those books that it is Moses who speaks without rendering Moses truly ridiculous and absurd. For example, Numbers, chapter 12, verse 3. Now the man Moses was very meek, above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. If Moses said this of himself instead of being the meekest of men, he was one of the most vain and arrogant of coxcombs, and the advocates for those books may now take which side they please, for both sides are against them. If Moses was not the author, the books are without authority, and if he was the author is without credit, because to boast of meekness is the reverse of meekness, and is a lie in sentiment. This gets super spurgy. In Deuteronomy, the style and manner of writing marks more evidently than in the former books that Moses is not the writer. The manner here used is dramatical. The writer opens the subject by a short introductory discourse and then introduces Moses as in the act of speaking. And when he has made Moses finish his harangue, he, the writer, resumes his own part and speaks till he brings Moses forward again, and at last closes the scene with an account of the death, funeral, and character of Moses. This interchange of speakers occurs 4 times in this book. From the first verse of the first chapter to the end of the 5th verse, it is the writer who speaks. He then introduces, thank you, Richard. What's up? Got our first super chat. 9 more, and we do the final cat reveal. He then introduces Moses as in the act of making his harangue, and this continues to the end of the 40th verse of the 4th chapter. Here the writer drops Moses and speaks historically of what was done in consequence of what Moses, when living, is supposed to have said, and which the writer had dramatically rehearsed. The writer opens the subject again in the first verse of the 5th chapter, though it is only by saying that Moses called the people of Israel together. He then introduces Moses as before, and continues him as in the act of speaking, to the end of the 26th chapter. He does the same thing in the beginning of the 27th chapter, and continues Moses as in the act of speaking to the end of the 28th chapter. At the 29th chapter, the writer speaks again through the whole of the first verse and the first line of the second verse, where he introduces Moses for the last time and continues him as in the act of speaking to the end of the 33rd chapter. The writer, having now finished the rehearsal on the part of Moses, comes forward and speaks through the whole of the last chapter. He begins by telling the reader that Moses went to the top of Pisgah, that he saw from thence the land which the writer says had been promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he, Moses, died there in the land of Moab, but that no man knows of his sepulture unto this day, that is, unto the time in which the writer lived who wrote the book of Deuteronomy. The writer then tells us that Moses was 110 years of age when he died, that his eye was not dim, nor his natural face abated, and he concludes by saying that there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom, says this anonymous writer, the Lord knew face to face. So I will say, Paine is doing the same thing here. Somebody said earlier in the text, or in the chat, that the Bible is different for initiates and non-initiates, and I agree with that. There are lots and lots and lots of layers of meaning and interpretations of normal texts, as in novels and popular fiction. I have an English degree, so it's like, yeah, I mean, billions of dollars are promised. There are tons of layers of textual interpretation, even from popular fiction. Now, when you look at sacred literature, there are a lot more, and in fact, usually they're almost all sacred texts were not originally for public consumption. This includes the I Ching, the Tao Te Ching, quite likely the Bible. They were meant for groups of initiates, and in many cases, they were teaching tools which required a teacher to decipher them. So, for instance, Revelation, let's just take Revelation. Revelation can be read at face value, in which it makes no sense whatsoever. And Paine is basically making the argument along with pretty much every Reddit Fedora atheist you've ever encountered, that, well, it doesn't make sense, so it's fake, right? He's looking at the literal level, where it's like, none of this makes sense. And it's like, yeah, literally, none of it makes sense as a literal depiction of anything, right? Now, I'm more willing to give leeway than Paine, particularly because, it was quite likely that information transmission was really, really hard back then. And most of this stuff was written down in a game of telephone, and we don't have a lot of the context. But I'm also much more lenient than Paine in this regard, because if you read a lot of these texts as spiritual metaphors, they're awesome. So for instance, let's take Revelation again as another example. And this applies to all of the books of the Bible. It particularly applies to the Old Testament. And remember, the Old Testament, or the books of the Old Testament written in Hebrew have entire layers of meaning that are completely opaque to non-Hebrew readers, let alone the gematria, the Kabbalah, the code underneath it. And there have been a few books in the last few decades by evangelicals purporting to decipher the code of the Bible. The Bible code was the most famous one, but they also completely missed the point, right? which is it is in code, but the code is Kabbalah. The code is gematria of the Hebrew alphabet, right? God's sacred language. Hebrew is the sacred language of the West, just like, period, point blank, just like Sanskrit is the sacred language of the East, period, point blank. Okay, so there's whole chunks of context and information missing if you just read it at the surface level. So to finally make this point about Revelation can also be read, if you squint your eyes like you're looking at a magic eye painting, can also be read as a text of how to do Kundalini yoga. When they're talking about the 7 churches and the 7 seals opening and all that, they're talking about the chakras. Okay, and if you're interested in that, Edgar Cayce wrote a whole book about that. So, but your average person on the street is never in a million years going to make those connections. It's just not going to happen. Whereas if you have that experience, like for instance, you've taken class at Magic.me, if you have that experience, then it immediately is apparent what they're talking about. Immediately. So that's just a bit of context there. So when people get ultra literal, whether they're nitpicky about it, as Paine is being, or, like Eric's saying, if they get ultra literal about it, like evangelical Christians who say the Bible makes perfect literal sense, it doesn't, right? So that is also a misinterpretation, and people are just taking things at too surface of a level. So a long way of saying, I don't necessarily agree with everything in this book. Take it with a grain of salt, just like everything, but man, it's well written and it's quite interesting. Okay. Having thus shown, as far as grammatical evidence applies, that Moses was not the writer of those books, I will, after making a few observations on the inconsistencies of the writer of the book of Deuteronomy, proceed to show from the historical and chronological evidence contained in those books that Moses was not, because he could not be, the writer of them, and consequently that there is no authority for believing that the inhuman and horrid butcheries of men, women, and children told of in those books were done, as those books say they were, at the command of God. I mean, they clearly could have been. I mean, have you looked at the history of the world? It is a duty incumbent on every true deist that he vindicate the moral justice of God against the calumnies of the Bible. The writer of the book of Deuteronomy, whoever he was, for it is an anonymous work, is obscure and also in contradiction with himself in the account he has given of Moses. After telling that Moses went to the top of Pisgah, and it does not appear from any account that he ever came down again, he tells us that Moses died there in the land of Moab, and that he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab. And as there is no antecedent to the pronoun he, there is no knowing who he was that did bury him. If the writer meant that he, God, buried him, how should he, the writer, know it? Or why should we, the readers, believe him? Sus Rando, thank you. Got another super chat. Number 2, even though it's not in the ticker, 8 more, and the final cat reveal is in order. Thank you so much. The writer also tells us that no man knows where the sepulchre of Moses is unto this day, meaning the time in which this writer lived. How then should he know that Moses was buried in a valley in the land of Moab? For as the writer lived long after the time of Moses, as is evident from his using the expression of unto this day, meaning a great length of time after the death of Moses, he certainly was not at his funeral. And on the other hand, it is impossible that Moses himself could say that no man knows where the sepulchre is unto this day. To make Moses the speaker would be an improvement on the play of a child that hides himself and cries, "Nobody can find me. Nobody can find Moses." So this is actually quite hilarious, because to read this from it as an initiate, right? He's describing how God actually acts. Where he's saying to make Moses the speaker would be an improvement on the play of a child that hides himself and cries, "Nobody can find me." This is what God does. God hides itself as everything for the benefit of being discovered. God hides itself as everything for the benefit of being discovered, meaning God creates suspension of disbelief. So, interesting, right? And this is true. This is often true of the Bible, where it makes zero sense from an uninitiated perspective, but then when you read it after you've had a certain amount of experience, now it reads completely different, right? Particularly if you've done a lot of Enochian. This writer has nowhere told us how he came by the speeches which he has put into the mouth of Moses to speak, and therefore we have a right to conclude that he either composed them himself or wrote them from oral tradition. One or the other of these is the more probable, since he has given in the 5th chapter a table of commandments, in which that call the 4th commandment is different from the 4th commandment in the 20th chapter of Exodus. In that of Exodus, the reason given for keeping the so this again could simply be down to translation errors or game of telephone errors of preserving information in the ancient world. So in that of Exodus, the reason given for keeping the 7th day is because, says the commandment, God made the heavens and the earth in 6 days and rested on the 7th. But in that of Deuteronomy, the reason given is that it was the day on which the children of Israel came out of Egypt. And therefore, says this commandment, the Lord thy God commanded thee to keep the Sabbath day. This makes no mention of the creation, nor that of the coming out of Egypt. I gotta let my dog out. Come on. All right, there you go. All right. It's also way too hot for the turtleneck. There are also many things given. Frauder's here. Thank you for the membership gifts. That's very, very kind of you again. Thank you so much. There are also many things given as laws of Moses in this book that are not to be found in any of the other books, among which is that inhuman and brutal law, chapter 21, verses 18 through 21, which authorizes parents, the father and the mother, to bring their own children to have them stoned to death for what is pleased to call stubbornness. So when I was younger, it's funny, right? Because now it's like I'm arguing against Paine. It's funny because it's very often that particularly, super like secular Marxist critics of the Bible will constantly pick things out and say, this is so awful. How could God allow this to happen? But usually they pull it out of context and miss the point that there's a broader story there. A classic one that is always used is, of course, the foundation of the Abrahamic religions, which is thank you. It's in there. Okay. What was I saying? Give me a second. I forget. Oh, the sacrifice, the binding of Isaac, right? Where Isaac is told to, or excuse me, Abraham is told to bring his child Isaac up to a mountain to sacrifice his child, right? Okay, let me lay this on you. And this will be very interesting for both Jewish and Christian viewers, I think. See, now it's Sunday. Now I've swapped personalities again, right? Now I'm no longer the critic of religion. I'm the defender of religion, as I can wear both hats, so to speak. So check this out. In the story of Abraham, and you will always hear Fedora Atheist picking on this one first. In the story of Abraham, Abraham is told by an angel to sacrifice his child Isaac at the top of Mount Moriah. This is essentially a test of faith. He is horrified by this. He is racked by his conscience. Finally, he decides that his faith in God must be absolute. So he brings Isaac to the top of Mount Moriah and prepares to sacrifice him, at which time the angel reappears and basically says, lol, JK, you don't actually have to sacrifice your child. God loves you, you're good. Okay, so always when you're debating or you're reading stuff from super atheist or agnostic or Marxist people, they will say things like, that is the most awful, terrible thing ever. And if like, this is how Abrahamic faith started, like what could be worse? This is ridiculous. Okay. There's more context to this. So, and this was given to me by a Greek Orthodox priest in LA. Okay. Father John Bacchus, who's been on the History Channel a lot. Fascinating guy. So he told me this in a class I took with a bunch of Greek senior citizens on theology. Think about it like this way. We already mentioned child sacrifice on the channel, right? Again, child sacrifice was practiced throughout the entire ancient world. The point of that story is saying that child sacrifice is no longer required. The point of that story is essentially God saying, and this is just the first part. The point of that story is God saying, no more child sacrifice. Right? So it's essentially a dramatized form of that I think of that shift in cultural values. Whether it ever happened or not is really not that important, because we're talking thousands of years ago and the effects are the same regardless. It could be a story, just like in the same way that many people have suggested that the story of Cain and Abel is a story about the transition of humanity from hunter-gatherer to agriculture, right? In the same way, it can be, I think, easily suggested that the story of the binding of Isaac is actually about the transition away from the very primitive belief that was then popular in child sacrifice, okay? So right there, as far as I'm concerned, the story is redeemed, but there's more to it. There's more to it. It turns out Mount Moriah, which is the mountain that the binding of Isaac occurred on, is also the same mountain that Christ was crucified on in the New Testament. So think about this, okay? What is God saying? God, in my opinion, God doesn't talk through. Let me put it this way: God speaks in the long term, okay? What is God saying? If you put those two stories together, think of it this way: God is saying, I do not require you to sacrifice children to me, unlike the other pagan gods, right? Because Yahweh was only one of a huge, bewilderingly large pantheon of gods in the Middle East that had begun with Sumeria, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and so on. He's saying, unlike those other gods, I do not require blood sacrifice. Child sacrifice, specifically. Then the crucifixion of Christ, and remember, Christ also specifically then contravenes blood sacrifice, period. But then Christ is crucified on Mount Moriah. So what God is saying is, not only do I not require you to sacrifice your child to me, I will sacrifice my child for you. So think about that. Suddenly the story is a little different, isn't it? If you don't take it totally, literally at face value. All right, where were we? Where he's talking about Abraham. But priests have I think this is where we stopped. But priests have always been fond of preaching up Deuteronomy, for Deuteronomy preaches up tithes, and it is from this book that they have taken the phrase and applied it to tithing, that thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the corn. And that this might not escape observation, they have noted it in the table of contents at the head of the chapter, though it is only a single verse of less than 2 lines. O priests, ye are willing to be compared to an ox for the sake of tithes. Though it is impossible for us to know identically who the writer of Deuteronomy was, it is not difficult to discover him professionally. That he was some Jewish priest who lived, as I shall show in the course of this work, at least 350 years after the time of Moses. So a couple questions here. So Kai says, I kind of get it, but God could have just said, don't sacrifice children. What we're talking about is an evolution of religious ideas over thousands of years. And I think one of the reasons why the blood of Christ is so harped upon is because Christ basically says, I am making the sacrifice of my blood for humanity. And that act in the New Testament explicitly bookends and puts an end to all other forms of sacrifice, including animal sacrifice. And Christ also says at one point, and you may want to listen to this, he says in the New Testament, the more complex your rituals, the less I'm going to listen. Where he said this pomp and circumstance and ritual in religion, you know, we're talking about big outdoor things where they're sacrificing tons of animals and all that. That's ego, essentially. That's vanity. I will listen to a prayer that is true and from the heart, and that's all that's required from me. And I find this to be true in magic as well. So we're talking about the evolution. So again, it's like the end of child sacrifice, the end of sacrifice period, and not just the end of sacrifice, but the idea now of God sacrificing on behalf of man, which to my knowledge had not been done before. Okay. And yes, Madeline brings up abortion, child sacrifice. That's a spicy topic, but I will suffice to say, I will agree that let me put it this way. Any evil that we can accuse the ancient world of, I guarantee you is still practiced now, and probably much more widely because there's so many people on the planet. Yeah, so A. Bannister says the non-literal view is the right view. Often, yes. Esoteric groups, including the founders of religious texts, never wanted these writings to be public. Yeah. And therein lies the rub, doesn't it? Right. And this is something that everyone on this channel should think deeply about. Right. So what we have here, you know, in many cases, in my opinion, the issue is not always religion. Right. This doesn't apply to the Quran, which is explicitly violent and awful. And man, is not metaphorical at all. It is totally literal. And you can tell because Muhammad did all the stuff in the book. But for a lot of other religions, what you're reading is literary allusion, metaphor, and I think that Paine touches on it much more closely in the first part, if you remember, where he says that when people are talking about prophecy, it's actually poetry. And I certainly don't think that that precludes it from being a sacred text, right? But the key there being people with low reading comprehension skills are essentially picking up esoteric texts. And not only the low reading comprehension, but they don't have the key to understand what it is, right? They don't have the decoder ring that would have been given to them by a teacher, or that we can get now by long study of these texts that are now available to us. So the problem is you get spiritual you get spiritual texts that are metaphorically true and so again, let's look at Revelation, right? Metaphorically true, but then people take them, but then they get out into the public, the troglodytes, as the Thelemites used to call them in the 70s, and I think we should bring back that word. Then the troglodytes get hold of them. The uninitiated, the unawakened, the uncurious, the brutal, the barbaric, those who are essentially still at an animal state of consciousness, which is true by the people from any walk of life, gender, nationality, orientation. I guarantee you can all be at animal levels of consciousness, right? People who are not at an animal level of consciousness are very rare on this planet, very rare. There's also lots of people who have fallen to demonic consciousness, which is different than animal consciousness. But I'm getting off point here. The issue is when you get esoteric texts that are then taken by the troglodytes, the normies, and taken literally, and then used used to cause violence or oppression or whatever it was that their animal self or demonic self wanted to do anyways, that they then find justification for in the text. And frankly, if that's what you want, convert to Islam, because the book explicitly says all the worst stuff imaginable and gives you license to do it. Taking child brides, etc., etc. It's just awful, right? So in many ways, like Islam could be said to represent the final culmination of that trend of taking, in this case, Jewish and Christian texts and taking a completely literal view and then just making your own version so you have your own street gang. So, thank you, Alex, very much. Alex says, loving these streams. I'm learning a lot about history in your streams than I ever did in school. That's very touching. Thank you, Alex. Brandon says, we like to call them cretins in the UK. Bucephus identifies as a troglodyte. That is hilarious. Yeah, A. Bannister also talks about astrological correlations in the Bible. Great point, right? So here's an example for those who know astrology. This is a really basic one. The four evangelists are specifically related to the four animals that are shown in the original Freudian initiated slip, that are shown in the world card of the tarot, or the universe card. The four cherubs of the elements are also the same as the four evangelists, and also represent the four seasons, and also represent the four elements, among other things, right? So if you know that, there's a whole other level of textual significance, and you're less likely to be literally hung up on whether they're... So think about it that way. Like, when you see it that way, are you now as interested into whether the four evangelists actually existed? Or are you more interested in saying, is it possible that those four books of the New Testament could be given elemental attributions, and would it check out? That's interesting. I don't know if anyone's ever done that before, but that's the kind of thing we're talking about. There's, the fish sign of Jesus is the symbol of Pisces, which is also the Vesica Pisces, which also has certain generative connotations, shall we say. And if you don't know any of that, you miss it. And then also a really bad thing that people can do is then they can get conspiratorial, and they start looking for, for a lot of people, particularly evangelicals, any hidden message is of course satanic. And so, that's where you get people like schizo obsessing over the what do you call it? Schizo obsessing over the like black cube of Saturn and all of that nonsense, whatever that's about. So there you go. So, but this is an eternal problem for religion, and it's obviously an eternal problem for religious figures, where they can speak when they're speaking in an initiated manner. But then the normies get hold of it, and it all is lost, right? And it really doesn't matter what the message is, by the way, because the normies will get hold of it and will turn it into what they already believe. So in a sense, it doesn't even matter what the religious message is. Okay. This is just an eternal part of human existence. And so I think that understanding that can help disentangle a little bit from a reflexive hatred of religion or of religious metaphors, right? As well as show you the problem, essentially zero in on the problem of often what happens with why religions go bad. Okay. Next. I come now to speak of the historical and chronological evidence. The chronology that I shall use is the Bible chronology, for I mean not to go out of the Bible for evidence of anything, but to make the Bible itself prove, historically and chronologically, that Moses is not the author of the books ascribed to him. So my opinion is, who cares? Who cares, right? Does Superman exist? It's like, well, we're going to get into Grant Morrison territory. So I have those gigantic Grant Morrison Batman omnibuses that I'm reading right now. It's like, does Batman exist? No. But if you like this green screen, this is a true story. If you like the green screen, somebody complimented it. If you like the microphone, if you like the camera, thank you, Lance. I swear, I shit you not, I was feeling overwhelmed with streaming. Thank you, Lance, very much. I was feeling overwhelmed with streaming, and so I thought, thank you, Jacobus. I literally was like, what would Batman say? Because I was like playing Batman Arkham Knight. So I just imagined in my mind talking to Batman, and he said to me, "You need better gear." I swear, this is a true story, and that's why this green screen is here. And he turned out to be right. Is Batman real? No. Does it matter? Well, do you like the new green screen? Then no, it doesn't. Desk wants to see the kitty. All right. Thank you very much. We're getting closer. All right. It is therefore proper that I inform the reader, such at least as may not have the opportunity of knowing it, that in the larger Bibles, and also in some smaller ones, there's a series of chronology printed in the margin of every page, for the purpose of showing how long the historical matters stated in each page happened, or are supposed to have happened before Christ, and consequently the distance of time between one historical circumstance and another. I begin with the book of Genesis. In the 14th chapter of Genesis, the writer gives an account of Lot being taken prisoner in a battle between the 4 kings against 5 and carried off, and that when the account of Lot being taken came to Abraham, he armed all his household and marched to rescue Lot from the captors, and that he pursued them unto Dan. Verse 14. To show in what manner this expression of pursuing them unto Dan applies to the case in question, I will refer to 2 circumstances, the one in America, the other in France. Yes, Brandon, Imagination Land from South Park. If you guys haven't seen Imagination Land, which is like a special from South Park, go watch Imagination Land. I swear to God, that special from South Park does more in an hour and a half than Alan Moore has done in like a good chunk of his career. Like, it's great. It's great. You have to see that. Imagination Land, South Park, highly initiated wisdom. I actually recommended it at the beginning of Add Up 2. So definitely go check that out if you haven't seen it. Highest possible recommendation. It's a great introduction to magical thinking and also the astral. The city now called New York in America was originally New Amsterdam, and the town in France, lately called Havre Marat, was before called Havre de Grace. New Amsterdam was changed to New York in the year 1664, Havre de Grace to Havre Marat in the year 1793. Should, therefore, any writing be found, though without date, in which the name of New York should be mentioned, it would be certain evidence that such a writing could not have been written before, but must have been written after New Amsterdam was changed to New York, and consequently not till after the year 1664, or at least during the course of that year. And in like manner, any dateless writing with the name, hey, Bucephus, thank you. Thank you, humble troglodyte. Greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. I now come to the application of those cases and to show that there was no such place as Dan till many years after the death of Moses, and consequently that Moses could not be the writer of the book of Genesis, where this account of pursuing them unto Dan is given. The place that is called Dan in the Bible was originally a town of the Gentiles called Laish, and when the tribe of Dan seized upon this town, they changed its name to Dan, in commemoration of Dan, who was the father of that tribe and the great-grandson of Abraham. Where'd my oregano go? Mama needs her oregano. She can't function without her oregano. I don't know. God damn it. Okay, well. To establish this in proof, it is necessary to refer from Genesis to the 18th chapter of the book called the Book of Judges. It is said there, verse 27, that they, the Danites, come unto Laish to a people that were quiet and secure, and they smote them with the edge of a sword. The Bible is filled with murder, and burned the city with fire, and they built a city, verse 28, and dwelt therein. And they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their father, howbeit the name of the city was Laish at the first. Okay, I keep interrupting this, but he's triggering me. Suddenly, the joint has disappeared. What the hell? So, one of the metrics he's using here is violence. Okay, so nonviolence is essentially a Christian virtue. It is not an the Old Testament says don't murder, but it doesn't say don't kill. Wait, I could be wrong about this. I believe in the original translation it says thou shalt not murder, which means it does not mean self-defense. Okay? And Christianity is fairly unique, and there are other religions, for instance, Jainism and Mahayana Buddhism, in being nonviolent to a fault, I would say. Other religions don't. Hey, Ryan, thank you very much. Other religions have different frameworks on it, right? So Judaism does not have that framework. Neither does Hinduism. Hindu ethics are you shouldn't go murdering people, but if somebody's going to come murder your family and you don't kill them to defend your family, you're culpable of the murder. That's more or less the Hindu view of it as given in the Bhagavad Gita in the dialogue between Arjuna and Krishna. So if you haven't read the Bhagavad Gita, that's also essential reading and is also on the AA reading list. How can we just disappear? This is very confusing. Maybe it was taken. Anyways, so what I'm saying here is we have to be careful about judging religious texts by standards that are not from that religion. And I believe that's covered in the discipline of hermeneutics. But people make this mistake all the time. For instance, when I was writing the John Dee book, there are all of the modern writers on John Dee had refused to take Dee at face value. They all dismissed the magic because it doesn't make sense by modern standards. I would argue it's fine that it doesn't make sense by modern standards, and you don't have to believe in it, and you don't need to embrace a Renaissance view of the world. But if your subject is somebody from the Renaissance who did believe all of this, and it was critical to their personality and their lifetime and why they made the decisions they did in their life, then you're not even seeing your subject if you don't see them on their own terms. And so it's simply bad scholarship, right? So we have to be careful about that too. What are you measuring by? I proceed now to, according to the chronological arrangement, the taking of Laish and giving it the name of Dan is made to be 20 years after the death of Joshua, who was the successor of Moses. And by the historical order as it stands in the book, it is made to be 306 years after the death of Joshua. And I see, thank you. More oregano has been found. All right. Don't copy me. Do as I say, not as I do. By the way, one of the reasons why I act so ridiculous online, and I know I act ridiculous online, and I know that I can peel the paint off the walls. I'm well aware of that. One of the reasons is so that people don't emulate me. Crowley was a little bit more ham-handed about that. But yeah, if people start taking me to be some type of religious figure, my work is effectively done. I can't get through to people at that point. So, and people are going to miss the point because the point of magic is you. That's why it's magic.me, me being you, right? Me being the person that types me. That's why it's magic.me, not magic.jason. That's why it's do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, not do what Jason wilt shall be the whole of the law. Because if you do what I do, you're gonna play a lot of PlayStation and it's gonna be kind of ridiculous. So, all right. Such is the crazy wisdom. I proceed now to state another point of historical and chronological evidence, and to show therefrom, as in the preceding case, that Moses is not the author of the book of Genesis. In the 36th chapter of Genesis, there is given a genealogy of the sons and descendants of Esau, who are called Edomites, and also a list by name of the kings of Edom, in enumerating of which it is said, verse 31, "And these are the kings that reigned in Edom before there reigned any king over the children of Israel." Now, were any dateless writings to be found in which, speaking of any past events, the writer should say, "These things happened before there was any Congress in America, or before there was any convention in France," it would be evidence that such writing could not have been written before, and could only be written after there was a Congress in America or a convention in France, as the case might be, and consequently, that it could not be written by any person who died before there was a Congress in the one country or a convention in the other. Nothing is more frequent, as well in history as in conversation, than to refer to a fact in the room of a date. It is most natural so to do, first, because a fact fixes itself in the memory better than a date. Secondly, because the fact includes the date and serves to excite two ideas at once, and this manner of speaking by circumstances implies as positively that the fact alluded to is past as if it were expressed. When a person speaking upon any matter says, "It was before I was married, or before my son was born, or before I went to America, or before I went to France," it is absolutely understood and intended to be understood that he had been married, that he has had a son, that he has been in America, or been in France. Language does not admit of using this mode of expression in any other sense. And whenever such an expression is found anywhere, it can only be understood in the sense in which it could only have been used. By the way, this is bad, okay? Drugs are bad. Even oregano, which is not bad for you. That doesn't matter because smoke is bad for you. And if you smoke anything enough, you'll get emphysema, okay? And emphysema is bad. So please subscribe and please send in super chats so I can buy a volcano vaporizer so that I'm not inhaling smoke. Because smoke is bad. All right. Much appreciated. All right. When a person speaking upon any matter says, "It was before I was married, or before my son was born, or before I went to America, or before I went to France," it is absolutely understood and intended to be understood that he had been married, that he has had a son, that he has been in America or been in France. Language does not admit of using this mode of expression in any other sense, and whenever such an expression is found anywhere, it can only be understood in the sense in which it only could have been used. The passage, therefore, that I have quoted, that these are the kings that reigned in Edom, before there reigned any king over the children of Israel, could only have been written after the first king began to reign over them, and consequently that the book of Genesis, so far from having been written by Moses, could not have been written till the time of Saul at least. This is the positive sense of the passage, but the expression, any king, implies more kings than one. At least it implies two, and this will carry it to the time of David. And if taken in a general sense, it carries itself through all times of the Jewish monarchy. Oh, I eat it too, Ryan. Any way I can get it. Had we met with this verse in any part of the Bible that professed to have been written after kings began to reign in Israel, it would have been impossible not to have seen the application of it. It happens then that this is the case. The two books of Chronicles, which give a history of all the kings of Israel, are professedly, as well as in fact, written after the Jewish monarchy began, and this verse that I have quoted, and all the remaining verses of the 36th chapter of Genesis are word for word in the first chapter of Chronicles, beginning at the 43rd verse. It was with consistency that the writer of the Chronicles could say, as he has said in Chronicles, 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 43, "These are the kings that reigned in the land of Edom, before any king reigned over the children of Israel," because he was going to give and has given a list of the kings that had reigned in Israel. But as it is impossible that the same expression could have been used before that period, it is as certain as anything that can be proved from historical language that this part of Genesis is taken from Chronicles. and that Genesis is not so old as Chronicles, and probably not so old as the Book of Homer, or as Aesop's Fables, admitting Homer to have been, as the tables of chronology state, contemporary with David or Solomon and Aesop to have lived about the end of the Jewish monarchy. Thank you, Josh. We're $20 closer to that vaporizer. Thank you so much. Who is my favorite South Park character? That will be for you to guess. Take away from Genesis the belief that Moses was the author, on which only the strange belief that it is the word of God has stood, and there remains nothing of Genesis but an anonymous book of stories, fables, and traditionary or invented absurdities, or of downright lies. The story of Eve and the serpent and of Noah and his ark drops to a level with the Arabian tales, without the merit of being entertaining, and the account of men living 800 to 900 years becomes as fabulous as the immortality of the giants of the mythology. Besides, the character of Moses, as stated in the Bible, is the most horrid that can be imagined. Ooh, sacrilegious. If those accounts be true, he was the wretch that first began and carried on wars on the score or on the pretense of religion, and under that mask or that infatuation committed the most unexampled atrocities that are to be found in the history of any nation. Oh, just wait, T-Pain. Just wait. We ain't talking about nothing when we're talking about the Old Testament, of which I will state only one instance. When the Jewish army returned from one of their plundering and murder... Yeah, man. See, I just don't agree with him here. The account goes on as follows. Numbers chapter 31, verse 13. And Moses and Eleazar the priest and all the princes of the congregation went forth to meet them without the camp. And Moses was wroth with the officers of the host, with the captains over thousands and captains over hundreds, which came from the battle. And Moses said unto them, Have ye saved all the women alive? Behold, these caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to commit trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor, and there was a plague among the congregation of the Lord. Now, therefore, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman that hath known a man by lying with him. But all the women children that have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. Among the detestable villains that in any period of the world have disgraced the name of man, it is impossible to find a greater than Moses. Oh, man, talk about sacrilegious. Even, this is too spicy even for me. It's impossible to find a greater than Moses if this account be true. Herein is in order to butcher the boys, to massacre the mothers, and debauch the daughters. So again, I'm going to want context on that, in context. Let any mother put herself in the situation of those mothers, one child murdered, another destined to violation, and herself in the hands of an executioner. Let any daughter put herself in the situation of those daughters destined as a prey to the murderers of a mother and a brother, and what will be their feelings? It is in vain that we attempt to impose upon nature, for nature will have her course, and the religion that tortures all her social ties is a false religion. After this order follows an account of the plunder taken and the manner of dividing it, and here it is that the profaneness of priestly hypocrisy increases the catalogue of crime. Verse 37, and the Lord's tribute of the sheep was 615, and the beeves were 30,006, of which the Lord's tribute was 312, and the asses were 30,000, of which the Lord's tribute was 301, and the persons were 16,000, of which the Lord's tribute was 32. In short, the matters contained in this chapter, as well as in many other parts of the Bible, are too horrid for humanity to read or for decency to hear. For it appears from the 35th verse of this chapter that the number of women children consigned to debauchery by the order of Moses was 32,000. People in general do not know what wickedness there is in this pretended word of God. Brought up in habits of superstition, they take it for granted that the Bible is true and that it is good. They permit themselves not to doubt of it, and they carry the ideas they form of the benevolence of the Almighty to the book which they have been taught to believe was written by his authority. Good heavens! It is quite another thing. It is a book of lies, wickedness, and blasphemy, for what could be greater blasphemy than to ascribe the wickedness of man to the orders of the Almighty? So, let's talk about something else in relation to this, which very often comes up in modern religious debate, because these debates are obviously all still going on every day. The question about whether violent passages in spiritual texts are metaphorical or not. Okay, thank you, Three Foxes. What up, 420? So, for instance, it seems to me in observation of religious debate that people will definitely interpret passages about violence differently depending on what result they want. So a classic one is the Islamic call to jihad. Okay, so if you talk to Muslim apologists, what they will tell you is that when Muhammad is talking about the jihad, he's talking about there's the lesser and the greater jihad. The lesser jihad is combat. The greater jihad is against the self. Okay, so that may be true, but in history, jihad absolutely does not mean jihad against self. In modern events, it absolutely does not mean that. And you'll often hear people saying Islam is a religion of peace and interpreting it differently because they're talking to an audience. They know what audience they're talking to. This is true of lots of books in the world, sacred books, not just Islam. It's also true of things like the Kala Chakra Tantra. It's certainly true of the Book of the Law. It's true of the Bible, right? So the question is, when we're reading passages that are violent, is it a metaphor for confrontation with oneself and one's lower qualities? Or is it a literal call to, for instance, in the case of Islam, to imperialist violence? Right? Or in this case, in the case of the Old Testament, we're talking about stuff that happened thousands of years ago in a time in which that was probably largely how the game was played in that part of the world. So anyways, I just wanted to point that out because this is like this question. People will go back and forth on this question. Apologists for different religions will go back and forth on that question depending on who they're talking to. And it may simply vary based on who's interpreting it. Okay. But to return to my subject, that of showing that Moses is not the author of the books ascribed to him and that the Bible is spurious, the two instances I have already given would be sufficient without any additional evidence to invalidate the authenticity of any book that pretended to be 400 or 500 years more ancient than the matters it speaks of, or refers to as facts. For in the case of pursuing them unto Dan, and of the kings that reigned over the children of Israel, not even the flimsy pretense of prophecy can be pleaded. The expressions are in the preterite tense, and it would be downright idiotism to say that a man could prophesy in the preterite tense. But there are many other passages scattered throughout those books that unite in the same point of evidence. It is said in Exodus, another of the books ascribed to Moses, chapter 16, verse 34, and the children of Israel did eat manna 40 years until they came to a land inhabited. They did eat manna until they came unto the borders of the land of Canaan. Whether the children of Israel ate manna or not, or what manna was, or whether it was anything more than a kind of fungus or small mushroom or other vegetable substance common to that part of the country, makes no part of my argument. All that I mean to show is that it is not Moses that could write this account, because the account extends itself beyond the life and time of Moses. Moses, according to the Bible, okay. This account of eating manna, which they tell us was written by Moses, extends itself to the time of Joshua, the successor of Moses, as appears by the account given in the book of Joshua, after the children of Israel had passed the river Jordan and came unto the borders of the land of Canaan. Joshua chapter 5, verse 12, and the manna ceased on the morrow, after they had eaten of the old corn of the land. Neither had the children of Israel manna any more, but they did eat of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. But a more remarkable instance than this occurs in Deuteronomy, which, while it shows that Moses could not be the writer of that book, shows also the fabulous notions that prevailed at that time about giants. In the 3rd chapter of Deuteronomy, among the conquests said to be made by Moses, is an account of the taking of Og, king of Bashan. Verse 12, for only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the race of giants. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rabbath of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth of it, after the cubit of a man. Okay, I'm going to have it. Okay, a cubit is 1 foot 9, 888 1,000ths inches. The length, therefore, of the bed was 16 feet 4 inches, and the breadth 7 feet 4 inches. Thus much for this giant's bed. Now, for the historical part, which, though the evidence is not so direct and positive as in the former cases, it is nevertheless very presumable and corroborating evidence, and is better than the best evidence on the contrary side. Okay, let's talk about numbers. Let's talk about numbers in spiritual texts. This is also important. Literalists will look at numbers in, for instance, the Bible or other sacred texts and assume that they are literal and nonsensical, right? So, for instance, but what they don't realize is that the number may have been used symbolically to signify something else rather than just raw number. So, for instance, an example would be the lives of when you're just saying people live 900 years in the Bible. Is that literal, or is there some gematria there, right? Is there something of numerology there? A really obvious example comes from, if you look at Buddhism. Buddhist texts constantly use the number 10,000. So, for instance, the 10,000 things, meaning the 10,000 distractions from the path, the 10,000 worlds, and so on. And so it's like, why 10,000? It just seems like an arbitrary number. The reason 10,000 is because 10,000 was, at that point, the highest known number and was used to represent infinity. So when they're saying 10,000, they mean infinite. If you don't know that, then it's going to seem arbitrary. But it's very, every single word in the Old Testament has a number associated with it that you can find through gematria, which is adding up the numerological values of Hebrew words, Hebrew characters and Hebrew words. And it is considered that the ones that have the same enumeration are in resonance with each other. And this is often how initiated texts work, and if you have experience, particularly with Western magic, you should understand this, particularly if you have, experience with Kabbalah or Cornelius Agrippa or 777, which Adept 2 students are currently working on. You understand that magical, Schieber says don't murder. Yes, thank you. And if you have specific clarification on that, I'm very curious. So, again, I would say that to judge the Old Testament or the Torah on a surface value is missing the rest of the iceberg. And it was quite likely constructed that way so that it wouldn't fall into the hands of the profane. I don't know. I'm not a historian of that stuff, so I don't know. But, but again, so it's like, is Thomas Paine an initiate? No. Yeah, The Age of Reason 2, The Empire Strikes Back. He's not writing in an initiated manner, right? He's writing as a deist, and he's writing as a free thinker and as a representation of Enlightenment thought, right? Which is great. But it's important to have that context. Rabbah was not a city belonging to this giant king. So, for instance, when they say giants, how do we know for sure that they meant physical? What if it was giant in spiritual stature or in some other manner? The knowledge, therefore, that this bed was at Rabbah and of the particulars of its dimensions must be referred to the time when Rabbah was taken, and this was not till 400 years after the death of Moses, for which see 2 Samuel, or 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 26. And Joab, David's general, fought against Rabbah of the children of Ammon and took the royal city. As I am not undertaking to point out all the contradictions in time, place, and circumstance that abound in the books ascribed to Moses, and which prove to demonstration that those books could not have been written by Moses, nor in the time of Moses, I proceed to the book of Joshua, and to show that Joshua is not the author of that book, and that it is anonymous and without authority. The evidence I shall produce is contained in the book itself. I will not go out of the Bible for proof against the supposed authenticity of the Bible. false testimony is always good against itself. Joshua, according to the first chapter of Joshua, was the immediate successor of Moses. He was, moreover, a military man, which Moses was not, and he continued as chief of the people of Israel 25 years, that is, from the time that Moses died, which according to the Bible chronology was 1,451 years before Christ, until 1,426 years before Christ, when, according to the same chronology, Joshua died. If, therefore, we find in this book said to have been written by Joshua reference to facts done after the death of Joshua, it is evidence that Joshua could not be the author, and also that the book could not have been written till after the time of the latest fact which it records. As to the character of the book, it is horrid. It is a military history of rapine and murder as savage and brutal as those recorded of his predecessor in villainy and hypocrisy, Moses, and the blasphemy consists, as in the former books, in ascribing those deeds to the orders of the Almighty. This also I find disingenuous. And the reason is that the Torah, the Old Testament, is a story about a group of people over a long period of time. And in a lot of that story, God is angry with people, or he's considered that they're not following his commandments. So it's a very human story. Throughout the Old Testament, particularly the book of Job and others, which we now believe is quite likely the oldest book, you see people struggling with their human foibles and the reality of life on earth, and dealing with huge world-shaking events. For instance, leaving Egypt, the burning of the second temple, the fall of the first and second temple, the Exodus, right? The Babylonian captivity, the Egyptian captivity, the exile into the world after the destruction of the second temple. And Reg says, does 666 refer to Emperor Nero? Quite likely, right? The book of Revelation is essentially a record of the fall of the second temple. So to cherry pick one thing is, again, it's like, well, where is it in the context of the story, right? So, because, anyways, I think that point is clear, I hope. But yeah, so 666, does it refer to Emperor Nero? Yeah, right, quite likely. And the best book on that is Revelations by Elaine Pagels. Someone says the issue with the violent passages in religious texts is the interpretation. It's why Islam has a unique problem with them while Judaism has not. Interesting, yeah. So whether or not it says this stuff in the Old Testament, you don't see people going around doing that stuff now. Whereas Islam explicitly, with almost no wiggle room, Islam, the Quran isn't teaching stories, which is what most of the Old Testament is. Most of the Old Testament are teaching stories where core human values and important lessons are being taught through historical or potentially not perfectly recorded, oral history. Whereas the Quran, you open it and it's basically just straight up like start chopping heads, boys. There's not a lot of room for interpretation. All right. Oh, interesting. Yeah, Kyle also says the Jesus Sutras, not going to lie, I love mixing those two. What say you? Is clearly a canonical expression of Buddhism on the Silk Road. Okay, interesting you bring this up. If I were a betting man, and I'm not, but the New Testament occurred. This is also blasphemous. The events of the New Testament occurred 500 years after the enlightenment of the Buddha, and 200 years after the formation of Mahayana Buddhism. And there's almost nothing in what Jesus teaches I'll put it this way. That's actually wrong. Almost every single thing that Jesus does has to be, for instance, the Mount Moriah story, almost everything single thing that Jesus does has to be considered as a symbolic action, which is in resonance with the rest of the text, including, and specifically, almost everything he does is meant to fulfill something that is in the Old Testament. If you're Christian, right? And lots of people aren't, which is fine. But the doctrine that he preached is pure Mahayana Buddhism. The vicarious atonement, the compassion for all beings, the understanding that we are all interconnected, and that when you hurt somebody, you hurt yourself. His injunction to love your neighbor as if they are yourself. What's he actually saying there esoterically? He's saying you're all at a certain level the same person. Humanity is a mass organism. So it makes no sense to kill people. So I would suspect that, I think that the whole thing, I used to think the whole thing about Jesus going to India and Tibet was a little too New Agey in his lost years. But clearly, let's put it this way. Whatever actually happened there was clearly in dialogue with other religious ideas that were contemporaneous. So, and if you talk to Buddhists now, they'll say things like, well, Jesus was a reincarnated bodhisattva, right, who incarnated at that time period. I don't know. But from a perfectly, thank you, Kyle, going hard with the Mahayana. I do that. But if you simply zoom out and go to a meta level and you're simply not concerned with religious truth at all, and you just observe these purely historically and literarily, you cannot fail to see that the things that Jesus was saying were very much in line with other contemporaneous new religious ideas, down to Buddha is enlightened under a tree, Jesus is crucified on a cross, right? So you see the resonance of this, the resonances of the story, and it's quite likely that you can look at Christianity as potentially has more to do with Mahayana Buddhism than it does with Judaism, and you can see it as a graft of material onto Western traditions from an Eastern tradition, which is the kind of thing that they do. What are the results? Well, that's for you to decide. So let's back up a little bit with the comments. And I know I'm a little stony and I keep getting off the text, but my mind keeps lighting up. Yeah, so someone says the issue with the violent passages in religious texts is the interpretation. It's why Islam has a unique problem with them while Judaism has not. And yeah, it's like, well, but I would say it's interpretation, but it's not just the interpretation. It's also the text itself, or the text, the Quran, the Hadiths, the Reliance of the Traveler, which is the civil code book of Islam, are not vague about how unbelievers should be treated. Excuse me. Someone also says, another factor is that narrative is a necessary conceit. Very literal readings of the Old Testament miss this. What do you mean by that? Excuse me. And Kai says, I struggle with barbarism and messed up laws in the Bible. Islam more so for obvious reasons. And then Romper Womb says, I don't get why he keeps harping on whether Moses literally wrote Genesis. I don't think he's talking about Genesis. He's talking about Exodus, but same. I don't get why he keeps harping on whether Moses literally wrote Exodus and Joshua wrote Joshua. Do these books actually claim that? I don't think they do. They were written by scribes. I think that's actually true. I don't think these books do claim that they were written by them. Oh no, maybe I'm wrong. Three Foxes says many believe he wrote them. Okay. Many English versions of the Bible claim he wrote them. They are referred to as books of Moses. I wonder what the current scholarship is on that. One would really have to look into the connection between the Hellenic world and Buddhism. That would be the transmission vector. Okay, so great. I'm glad you're bringing this up. There was a connection between the Hellenic world and Buddhism. There clearly was, right? during that time in the world, there wasn't this idea of sectarianism as we currently understand it, right? Particularly when the Silk Road was active, all these ideas were being shared, gods were being shared. Okay, so here's an example. Ganesh, the Hindu god, was originally an Egyptian god. He's an animal-headed god, just like Sobek or Horus or any of the other ones. I keep forgetting. But there was, yes, thank you. There was absolutely, I'm saying to the off-camera spirits, there was definitely a connection between the Hellenic world and Buddhism. Absolutely. Absolutely there was. Historically validatable to the point where I think Buddhism actually went into the Hellenic world and vice versa. And there's been a lot more scholarship on this in the last 5-10 years. So that is definitely something to look up. This is only oregano, yes. Richard says, yeah, I always saw parallels between the temptation of Christ on the mountain from Satan and the story of the Buddha. And Mike Crowley would say that Buddha was like, Michael Crowley, yeah, would say that the Buddhist psychedelic writer would say that Buddha was like Mahavira, Jainism. Yeah, absolutely, right? Christ being tempted in the desert is the exact same story as the Buddha being tempted by the demon Mara under the Bodhi tree. It's the same story, but transposed into the desert. And also, one of the things that scholars have really pointed out, and Crowley liked to point out, is these stories of these messiahs are, like, for instance, the Jesus story. There were probably thousands of crucified messiah claimants at that time who had the exact same story. And there are lots of elements that, for instance, Crowley used to harp on this. There's tons of elements of the Jesus story that are just the story of Osiris or Horus from Egypt, right? So, and it's interesting, in my own personal experience, when you go, like, I've spent a lot of time going and hanging out with spiritual groups of all different types. And one of the things you start to notice is they will recycle stories between them and change the details. So a classic one is, I've heard this in both Hindu and Buddhist groups, this story about somebody was on the road and then they met a beggar and they were cruel to the beggar, and then one person was kind to the beggar, and then the beggar turned out to be, a saint or the Buddha or so forth. Like, I've heard that exact same story told in different cultural contexts for different religious figures. And so I think, like, if we have to be honest here, there's just a certain amount of priestcraft here where religions copy from each other because they're all in the same business. They're all doing R&D on the religion business. And, another classic example, the Gelug tradition of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, the most organized one, and the Catholic Church have a lot in common. The hell realms are very similar. The architecture is similar in its Gothic imposition and so forth. And so there's also just a lot of real world pragmatism you have to bring to this, which is like people talk to each other. People share ideas, Kyle asks, is Mahayana Buddhism peaceful, I think is your question. Yes, but I will point out, when we talk about Buddhism, even the Buddhists have taken up arms against Islam. Like, even the Dalai Lama has come out against Islam and has said that Europe cannot be Islamized, for which he was called a white supremacist, which makes absolutely no sense, right? But, obviously, this is a serious problem in Myanmar right now, previously called Burma, where with the Rohingya, where the Buddhists and Muslims are in like open conflict, where a shit ton of people have been dying for a long time, right? And there's quotes from, and I'm not supporting this, I'm not saying this, but it's like, you get quotes from Burma of like Buddhist monks. You can see pictures of Buddhist monks with AKs, like with whole stacks of weapons and stuff, which I'm not recommending for people. But even they will have been on record saying things about Islam, like if you lay down with a dog, you're going to get fleas, things like that. So, it's like you don't tolerate a dog biting you in your own house. Shebrew says life was brutal, but at least Moses gave us the 10 Commandments. If they were resembling the Homistinians, I kind of get it. Well, yeah, that's the thing, right? And this is kind of what I'm dancing around right now, where it's like the question is context, geographical context, context with the tribes that were around them, the fact that God knows what the Egyptians were like. They had been enslaved by the Egyptians. God knows what all these other tribes were like. And if it wasn't them, it would have been the other tribes doing the exact same thing. And you see this now also. This is true down to today, which you mentioned it. I wasn't going to bring it there, but you mentioned it, where you look at the current conflict in the Middle East, and you get American post-Christian liberals judging the Middle East situation from the frame of Christian ethics, which first of all are never done by an outside force in our own territory since the Civil War, and that was us doing it to us. Because of geography, Frater RC, I don't know, he's particularly a savage Canadian warlord and maybe leading a attack force against America at some point. Anyways, you get my point, right? Where it's like we're judging a situation from the outside that we haven't lived in. And on this topic, for instance, and I think it actually relates to the Old Testament, I recently read the book From Beirut to Jerusalem by Thomas Friedman, who's a pretty famous journalist. And he was reporting for, I believe, AP from Beirut during the Lebanon War in 1982. And he talks about, and this was, a very infamous period in history where Israel invaded Lebanon. The Maronite Christians in Lebanon started massacring Muslims. And there was a very infamous incident called the Sabra and Shilat massacre. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, where the Christians massacred Muslims and the IDF was blamed for not doing anything about it, if I'm getting that right. When you read Thomas Friedman, you get this picture of the Middle East as just being working by different rules, shall we say, as respecting strength, as, and we see what's happening in Syria. People love to blame Israel, but it's like, look at what's happening in Syria. That doesn't have anything to do with Israel, right? So Thomas Friedman makes a really clear point where, he calls it Middle East rules, right? Like fights happen by Middle East rules. Those are the rules of the neighborhood. Now, I don't live in the Middle East, but I'm telling you kind of Thomas Friedman's interpretation on that, which I think is interesting thinking about in terms of the Old Testament. So too long didn't read. My response would be yes, and let's look at the other guys too. Let's see what they were doing, right? Because you do read some of the accounts of some of these cultures in the Old Testament that are god awful, right? And we know also from historical evidence that, for instance, there was mass child sacrifice, most likely practiced at Carthage in North Africa. They found essentially potter's fields of sacrificed children and so on. Anyways, let's see if I got all the questions. But yeah, to your point, if they're dealing with some people who are acting like Hamas, it's like, well, don't you think we need that context to the story? Okay. And when someone says things like that are what I'm getting at when literal readings of the Old Testament miss things. Eric says, did the stories happen twice or was someone borrowing? Somebody was clearly borrowing because they were the exact same story. Sus says, recently listened to the story of Hanuman, and the first thing the author emphasized was that Hanuman serves Ram and is Ram at the same time. Right, exactly, right? And that's the type of thinking, like for instance, that's like Hinduism thinking, which makes perfect sense in a Hindu ontological context, but makes exactly zero fucking sense to Westerners. And I can tell you from personal experience that when you're in a Hindu ontological context, reality behaves as if it is Hindu. And I've seen miracles happen in front of my eyes, as in physical laws of nature breaking in a Hindu context, and it made perfect sense in a Hindu context, but not in a Western one. And so there's something here about the kind of, It's an almost Michel Foucault type idea that there is such a thing as consensus reality, and the reality to some extent is formed by the consensus. And the thing that I'm constantly pointing out to people in one way or another is that if you want to understand, if you want to see the code for the consensus, it tends to be the sacred text that culture operates off of. So yeah, but somebody who's an ultra literalist would pick that up and just be like, this was written by idiots. It's not, right? It's written at a deeper level, operating off of ontological assumptions that you don't have and are not yours, but that doesn't automatically make them wrong. And the thing that I have pushed and pushed and pushed my entire life, and that no matter how social justice-y people are, they won't do, is just to tell people we Americans are on a level cultural playing field with everyone else in the world. And if we want to understand them, we need to understand them on their terms, not ours. We need to understand their worldviews because frankly, in a lot of cases, other cultures have much more sophisticated worldviews than we do. India in particular, 10,000-year-old tradition. Do you think they might know a few things we don't? I'd say so. Kyle, thank you. The Religion of Peace doesn't understand that the B-52s are a really good band from Atlanta. That is hilarious. Although, luckily, I don't think Islam has B-52s. Thank you very much. We're one away from the final cat reveal. Silly Dilly was crucified once. I'm glad you survived. Zagreus, I don't know what that is. Or the theory that Moses was Akhenaten. Okay, great, right? So Akhenaten in Egypt was the first monotheist. For him, the sun was the only god. I don't know about a theory that Moses was Akhenaten, but we can definitely see, taking a literary analysis of religions of this time period, that the idea of, and Crowley's great on this, the idea of the dying and resurrected God who represents the sun, whether that's Akhenaten, Christ, Buddha, Osiris, Horus, or so on, is the same story repeating in different cultural contexts. And the reason is because our understanding at the time was that we thought the sun died when it went over the horizon, and therefore religious rituals were necessary to propitiate the sun to get it to come back. And therefore the figures of God represented that. Now we understand that the sun doesn't go away, so from a Thelemic context, we can begin to understand, we can have a little bit less anxiety about that, and I'll leave it at that for now. If you want to know more, read my introduction to Lon's book, The Magic of Aleister Crowley. I read it in Adept 1 as well. Sus says, immediately made me think of Jesus and how the Bible emphasizes he's both the Son of God and God at the same time. Right, which makes absolutely no sense to literal thinkers, right? Shebrew says, Moses clearly was a scribe because he gave us the 10 Commandments. Okay. Someone says, the warrior Buddhist monk aesthetic goes hard. Absolutely. Mike's cutting off? I'm not sure. Restart the app. Someone says, one also has to put the war literature within the Old Testament into the context of both propaganda and the wider region. Yeah. What we find moral today is far different than the norm in the past. Absolutely. Absolutely. And what people find moral in one religious context or in one part of the world is different for other contexts in other parts of the world. So Middle East rules, right? As Thomas Friedman said. So we always need to be careful about clearly seeing the frame through which we're interpreting information. And it's shocking the level of unself-awareness people have about that, right? Chad's amped for Imagination Land. Chad says, I've rarely heard you make claims of supernatural. It's good to hear. Hindus are correct. Thank you, Meat Wolf. I think it has to be more than $5, but thank you very much. Thoughts on the Muse? I love the Muse. I recommend it. I should put an affiliate link for it. It's great. Zedekiah says, ugh, love this. I've seen the same after developing a relationship with Shiva. Fascinating. Chad says, George Carlin also thought the sun was a legitimate god. I know I have Thelemites here, so for those who have ears to hear. Cafe Cedarbeard says solar maximum with eclipses, Neptune, Saturn, and Venus, and Mercury retro near equinox is bog energy and highly rare. What is bog energy? Oh, Temple says Zagreus was the Jesus prototype. Oh, we got our 10 super chat. New cat reveal coming up. Reg will be very happy. Kai, thank you. Let's see the cats. Okay. All right. Yeah, I don't understand astrology very well, so all right. Yeah, totally. Chad says cultural relativism. I heard that Marvel movies look silly to Easterners because smiling has a different value there. Yeah. And yeah, it's like, for instance, and China's a perfect example. Like, good luck interpreting China from Western values. Good luck with that. I'll be over in the corner heavily studying the I Ching, the Analects of Confucius, the sayings of Mao, the actual history of China and its sacred texts to even begin to dare to say that I might start to have a chance one day of understanding it. I will never, ever understand China from my lens. So, all of which is to say, I don't necessarily agree with Thomas Paine. The tale of this, yeah. So actually, you know what? This is getting so nitpicky that I'm a little bit tempted to skip ahead. All right, so let's skip ahead a little bit because he's just going on and being pedantic about. Yeah, we got the fake oregano in Texas, but it's still getting messed up. I have high tolerance to everything. It's unfortunate. Okay, so he goes on for several more pages of this type of thing. I think we get the point. All right, now he says, I have now gone through all the books in the first part of the Bible to which the names of persons are affixed as being the authors of those books, and which the church, styling itself the Christian church, has imposed upon the world as the writings of Moses, Joshua, and Samuel, and I have detected and proved the falsehood of this imposition. So I think it's also important to point out here that when he's talking about the Old Testament, he's doing it to attack the Catholic Church, not Jews. All right. And now, ye priests of every description who have preached and written against the former part of the age of reason, what have ye to say? Well, will ye, with all this massive evidence against you, and staring you in the face, still have the assurance to march into your pulpits and continue to impose these books on your congregations as the works of inspired penmen and the word of God, when it is as evident as demonstration can make truth appear that the persons who ye say are the authors are not the authors, and that ye know not who the authors are? What shadow of pretense have ye now to produce for continuing the blasphemous fraud? What have ye still to offer against the pure and moral religion of Deism in support of your system of falsehood, idolatry, and pretended revelation? Had the cruel and murderous orders with which the Bible is filled and the numberless torturing executions of men, women, and children, in consequence of those orders, been ascribed to some friend whose memory you revered, you would have glowed with satisfaction at detecting the falsehood of the charge and gloried in defending his injured fame. Is it because ye are sunk in the cruelty of superstition, or feel no interest in the honor of your Creator, that ye listen to the horrid tales of the Bible, or hear them with callous indifference? The evidence I have produced, and shall produce in the course of this work, to prove that the Bible is without authority, will, while it wounds the stubbornness of a priest, relieve and tranquilize the minds of millions. It will free them from all those hard thoughts of the Almighty, which priestcraft and the Bible had infused into their minds, and which stood in everlasting opposition to all their ideas of his moral justice and benevolence. I come now to the 2 books of Kings and the 2 books of Chronicles. Those books are altogether historical and are chiefly confined to the lives and actions of the Jewish kings, who in general were a parcel of rascals. But these are matters with which we have no more concern than we have with the Roman emperors or Homer's account of the Trojan War. Besides which, as those works are anonymous and as we know nothing of the writer or of his character, it is impossible for us to know what degree of credit to give to the matters related therein. Like all other ancient histories, they appear to be a jumble of fable and of fact, and of probable and of improbable things, but which distance of time and place and change of circumstances in the world have rendered obsolete and uninteresting. The chief use I shall make of those books will be that of comparing them with each other and with other parts of the Bible to show the confusion, contradiction, and cruelty in this pretended word of God. The first book of Kings begins with the reign of Solomon, which, according to Bible chronology, was 115 years before Christ. Oh, God, is he going to go into this again? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, someone says the pedantic side of Thomas Paine would fit incredibly well on Reddit. Yeah, I definitely had that thought when I was reading this. And that's why I made the comment earlier where it's like, you can probably trace a line of cultural DNA from today's cringe Redditors to this, but that further demonstrates my thesis that this is a foundational work for the American religious mind in much the same way that we could likely argue Emerson and Thoreau were, right? Or Henry James, Varieties of Religious Experience. Or Jung, Josh says. So let's skip past some of the pedanticness because it's frankly kind of boring. Yeah, oh God, yeah. Now, a few pages later, we're getting into tables of prophets. Let me do you a solid and spare you. It's just, if you're interested in reading it, it's probably free online. But let's get to the more fun stuff. Yeah, he's just like page after page after page of going through the Old Testament. And him being like, no. Okay, he then does it for the New Testament. And then he concludes. Okay, let's see what he says about the New Testament. Let's get a taste at least. So this will probably be the last Age of Reason thing because we skipped enough to finish today. Chapter 2, turning to the New Testament. The New Testament, they tell us, is founded upon the prophecies of the Old. If so, it must follow the fate of its foundation. As it is nothing extraordinary that a woman should be with child before she was married, and that the son she might bring forth should be executed, even unjustly, I see no reason for not believing that such a woman as Mary, and such a man as Joseph and Jesus existed. Their mere existence is a matter of indifference about which there is no ground either to believe or to disbelieve, and which comes under the common head of, it may be so, and what then? The probability, however, is that there were such persons, or at least such as resembled them in part of the circumstances, because almost all romantic stories have been suggested by some actual circumstance, as the adventures of Robinson Crusoe, not a word of which is true, were suggested by the case of Alexander Selkirk. It is not the existence or non-existence of the persons that I trouble myself about. It is the fable of Jesus Christ as told in the New Testament, and the wild and visionary doctrine raised thereon, against which I contend. The story, taking it as it is told, is blasphemously obscene. It gives an account of a young woman engaged to be married, and while under this engagement she is, to speak plain language, debauched by a ghost, under the impious pretense, Luke chapter 1, verse 35, that the Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the highest shall overshadow thee. Notwithstanding which, Joseph afterward marries her, cohabits with her as his wife, and in turn rivals the ghost. Man, this is so pedantic. This is so pedantic that it's actually kind of hard to read out loud because he's being so utterly literalist about things. Yeah. This is putting the story into intelligible language, and when told in this manner, there is not a priest but must be ashamed to own it. Obscenity in matters of faith, however wrapped up, is always a token of fable and imposture, for it is necessary to our serious belief of God that we do not connect it with stories that run, as this does, into ludicrous interpretations. Okay, here, this is interesting. This story is, upon the face of it, the same kind of story as that of Jupiter and Leda, or Jupiter and Europa, or any of the amorous adventures of Jupiter. My OTO people, those who have ears to hear, let them hear. And shows, as is already stated in the former part of the Age of Reason, that the Christian faith is built upon the heathen mythology. As the historical parts of the New Testament, so far as concerns Jesus Christ, are confined to a very short space of time, less than 2 years and all within the same country, and nearly to the same spot, the discordance of time, place, and circumstance, which detects the fallacy of the books of the Old Testament and proves them to be impositions, cannot be expected to be found here in the same abundance. The New Testament compared with the Old is like a farce of one act, in which there is not room for very numerous violations of the unities. There are, however, some glaring contradictions, which, exclusive of the fallacy of the pretended prophecies, are sufficient to show the story of Jesus Christ to be false. I'm actually curious about something. I'm actually curious. I want to check Paine's claims here because we may see this differently from modern scholarship as well. So let's go to our friend Grok. Okay. What is the best current historical evidence as to whether Moses existed? And we'll tell it to deep search. Yeah, we might try a couple different AIs. We should try China's and see what China's say. All right, there we go. Because he's making a bunch of scholarship claims. He's making a bunch of scholarship claims from the late 1700s, and we may simply just have more clear information now. All right. I'm going to look at comments while AI is thinking. Yeah, so no one, someone. New atheism was also likely heavily influenced by Paine. That is the conduit for much of the pedantic views of religion for a generation. So that's kind of what I was suspecting while reading this, but do you have a source for that? Because I would love to see it. I would love to see it if you have a source for that. Yeah, Cafe Cedarbeard says Paine in my arse. Meatwolf says, did the membership option get blocked? No, it should be right there where it says join. If not, turn your ad blocker and VPN off. Thoth, yeah. Yeah, Cafe Cedarbeard says, in his time, the ideas were a new brainstorm. It was inevitable. What would the crush of the previous age? Are you talking about Paine or Christ? Chance of a super chat goal for an epic monologue reading in mommy blogger voice. Fuck it. Yeah, let's do it, because we already got the cat in. All right. Start another goal. Oops. Epic mommy blogger reading. Madison, make sure to show the product. Make sure to show the product in the TikTok. Okay, so research suggests there is no definitive historical evidence for Moses outside the Bible, but the Moses stele is often cited as a potential clue. The Moses stele from around 1250 BCE, I've never heard of this, depicts an Egyptian official named Mose, and some interpret it as M-O-S-E, and some interpret this as linked to the biblical Moses, though this is debated. Scholars are divided. Some see Moses as a legendary figure, while others believe a Moses-like figure may have existed in the 13th century BCE. I will also say that, and this is true of a lot of other stories, like, for instance, I believe Manu. Moses may be a composite character, or any religious figure may be a composite. So, for instance, the one that I would clearly point to as quite likely a composite is Buddha, and I would suspect that the Buddha probably represented an esoteric school of people, right? But in the same way, somebody mentioned Hermes Trismegistus. Okay, there was never a Hermes Trismegistus. However, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of works attributed to Hermes Trismegistus throughout the entire first millennium. And the reason is it was a pen name used to stay anonymous. I'm not saying that's clearly related, but it is a bit related. It was a pen name used to stay anonymous by writers in the Hermetic tradition. So the Hermetic writers, we don't know who they were because they all collectively wrote as Hermes. In a non-religious context, similarly, in the 1960s, the Situationists, who were a Marxist splinter who had a lot of really interesting ideas, wrote all of their tracts, all the stuff they wrote under the pen name Luther Blissett. So there are all these Situationist texts put out in Europe by Luther Blissett, right, which was an anonymous pen name. So, okay. Yeah, the best current historical evidence is the Moses Stele, an artifact from the reign of Ramses II, 1279 to 1213 BCE. Found near Pi Ramesses, mentioned in the Bible as a city built by Israelites, it shows a high-ranking official named Mosi. The name Mosi means son in Egyptian, similar to the biblical Moses, and its timing aligns with the Exodus period. However, its connection to the biblical Moses is interpretive and not universally accepted. It may just mean that that was a common name. Let's see if there's anything else in here. So more on the stele. Yeah, the best current historical evidence for Moses' existence is the Moses Stele, an artifact from the 19th dynasty, dated around 1250 BCE during Ramses II's reign. This stele, housed in the Romer und Palazius Museum in Hildesheim, Germany, was found in Pontier, near the ancient city of Pi Ramses, which the Bible in Exodus 1:11 states was built by the Israelites. The stele depicts a high-ranking Egyptian official named Moses, described as a general in Ramses II's army, receiving gifts from the king with inscriptions praising his achievements, such as "How good is what he has done? Great, great, great job." The name Moses in Egyptian means son or begotten by, which aligns with the biblical name Moses, derived from the Torah's account in Exodus 2:10, where Pharaoh's daughter names him Moshe, possibly from an Egyptian root. The stele's location near Pi Ramses and its dating to Ramesses II's reign, often associated with the Exodus, provided potential links. We're talking about the same time period. Some sources, such as Mayim acronym, argue that this could be evidence for the biblical Moses, citing the name similarity, the military role, aligned with Talmudic and Midrashic descriptions. Forgive me if I'm getting the pronunciations wrong. Talmudic and Midrash, it's either Midrashic or Midrashic, if someone can tell me, descriptions of Moses as a warrior and the historical context. For instance, the stele notes Ramesses was pleased with Moses' speech, which some connect to the biblical Moses' speech impediment in Exodus 4:10. However, it's not universally accepted. Okay. The majority of scholars see Moses as largely legendary, retaining the possibility that a Moses-like figure existed in the 13th century BCE. William G. Dever, for example, argues that archaeology can do nothing to prove or confirm Moses' existence, suggesting he is mostly mythical, but possibly based on a historical figure. Some, like Conrad Schmidt and Jens Schroeder, believe Moses could have been a historical figure, potentially a leader of a group of Semitic slaves who escaped Egypt. A Moses-like figure may have existed during the New Kingdom, establishing a new religion based on monotheism. Then others like Martin Noth, as cited in Encyclopedia Britannica, was skeptical of the roles attributed to Moses, proposing he was an obscure person from Moab around whom traditions were woven. The Guardian, well, fuck The Guardian, I don't take anything they say seriously, states there is no historical figure of Moses and no reason from archaeology to suppose the Exodus story is true. Okay, that solves it. That's it. The Guardian says he didn't exist. They lie about everything. He existed. Case closed. Here's a couple other theories. Israel Knoll's theory. Knoll identifies Moses with Ursu, a Levantine usurper mentioned in Papyrus Harris I and the Elephantine Stele, suggesting a historical basis for the Exodus without divine elements. It's not widely accepted.